Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the AdMonsters 2025 End of the Year LinkedIn Live. Before I get into my regular intro, I just wanted to say, everyone, as you kind of join in, say hi as you come into the chat, just so we can see who's joining us throughout the conversation. You'll have time to kind of comment, ask questions, and say something like that. Okay, Helen, I see you popping in. I'm ready to. And if anyone didn't hear that, just as you come and enter the chat, just say hello, just so we can see people are kind of joining in. You'll have an opportunity to kind of ask Chris questions as the conversation goes on. We see Helen, I'm ready. Okay. Any more people kind of mulling in? Okay, we got Lynn popping up in the chat. Maybe give it another 20, 30 seconds to see if more people file in. Just one more warning as you come in, just say hi. And okay, Liam. Okay, we see some more people popping in. Okay. Hello, Liam. Hello, Eleni. Okay, so it seems like people are joining us, so I can come in and start the intro. Hello, everyone. Welcome to AdMonsters 2025 End of the Year LinkedIn Live. As 2025 wraps up, the ad tech world has been seen its fair share of shakeups, and no one tracks the shifts quite like Chris Kane and the team at Jounce Media. From mapping money flows across millions of sites and apps to analyzing the subtle supply path shifts that separate durable publishers from those at risk, Jounce's data offers a revealing lens on the health of the digital ad ecosystem. In this LinkedIn Live, we'll dive into the year's defining stories, the Google ad tech antitrust verdict and what it really means for publisher stacks, the high stakes debate over transaction IDs and who should control them, and the ongoing evolution of SSPs, resellers, and supply chain transparency. We'll also explore how AI is changing traffic patterns and what publishers should be watching as audience behavior shifts in real time. Thank you, Chris, for joining us for this conversation. It's kind of become like an annual tradition for me to talk to you about.
Thank you for including me again. I'm looking
Yeah,
forward
of
to it.
course, about what 2025 is. We always appreciate you bestowing your wisdom upon us. And before we kind of hop on into the conversation, I'm sure most people, if they don't know you, at least have heard of you, can you kind of just give an intro to what you do at your company and stuff?
Sure, yeah. So I started Jounce 10 years ago. We are a research business focused on the programmatic supply chain. And based on, I think, a really rich set of data inputs that we receive from ad tech platforms and also from media buying teams, we maintain measurements and classifications of all RTB supply chains across web, mobile app, and connected TV supply. I think today's conversation will probably primarily focus on web. But we are constantly sort of studying the data, looking at the most current view of the way that inventory is presented to DSPs, the way that DSPs are bidding back into those auctions, and then through a subscription-based service, trying to arm our clients with the best possible insights. Some of that is research reports and webinars, some of it is dashboards, some of it's data feeds, but it's all in service of trying to give our clients on the buy side and the sell side of the market the best possible information about the current state of the supply chain.
Yeah, absolutely. So much data about different aspects of the supply chain for everyone to kind of mull over. And as we delve into the conversation, I just want to say, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, if anyone has questions or concerns as we hop through different topics, just make sure to put them in the chat. I'm kind of paying attention as we go to the conversation. I'm even seeing some more familiar faces as I was going through my intro. Hey, Gavin. Hey, Justin. Hey, Ryan. Thanks for joining us. And just to hop into the first question, I kind of want to dig more into some of the research that you kind of went through this year before we go into some of the topics I discussed in my intro. So over the past year, what are one or two data points from Jounce's research that you think should keep publishers up at night that they should be paying attention to, especially going into 2026?
So we publish research every month. And one of the things that we open every report with, we've been doing this for, 6-7 years now, is a simple measurement of how is the average publisher monetizing its supply. And so I just pulled up the report we published this month. Today, I don't think this will be a surprise to anybody on this webinar, but there's an interesting so what. Today, the average publisher works with more than 25 SSPs. We think it's 26 directly integrated SSPs.
Wow.
The average publisher authorizes 16 or 17 of those directly integrated SSPs to then run resold auctions through reselling exchanges. And if you add it all up, those resold auctions account for 39% of display ads and 29%, 39% of display auctions, and 28% of video auctions. My point in all of this is reselling is a part of the monetization strategy for most publishers. I think I understand why. I think it is rational. I think there's a proven ability for those sorts of supply chains to generate incremental yields for publishers. I also think we're starting to see signs that demand is drying up for those resold supply chains. And so I don't know the right answer here, but I think there's a very delicate balance that publishers on the web and elsewhere need to be thinking about as it relates to reselling. There are publishers that do not work with any resellers. They don't ever enable a directly integrated SSP to run a resold auction through another exchange, but those are exceptions. There's also publishers that I think are highly dependent on resellers. And there's probably some optimal point that's in between those two ends of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And that optimal point keeps moving, like as buyers shift their buying behavior, particularly as the big DSPs get more aggressive in blocking reselling, the rational yield strategy for publishers changes as well. And so it's this sort of like constantly moving target, I think, if you're a publisher, where, if you're bombarding the buy side of the market with tons of resold auctions, potentially that is harmful to your revenue. If you have no reselling, you're potentially leaving money on the table. And so I think it's a very delicate balancing act that publishers already strike and that are going to need to continue to manage in 26.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I'm with Helen. When you kind of said, how many SSPs publishers are working with 26, 25, and Helen said, dang, 25. And I think I kind of had the same reaction as well, because I think I'm hearing a lot of conversations with publishers about how many intermediaries are kind of coming in and kind of stealing their pennies and different things like that, and especially dealing with programmatic. And you also talked about the reseller conversation, which we'll dig into a little bit later. But definitely understand where you're coming from that. And then finally, more question about the data before we move into the more specific topics. Jounce maps money flows from DSPs to publishers across millions of sites and apps, as we both said at the beginning. What shifts in those supply paths do you see this year as the most clearly separate durable publishers from those at risk?
There's a report that we wrote over the summer we called the Best of the Web. And what we're trying to do is put some math behind what are the ad product choices that web publishers make that have a real effect on marketer business outcomes, like sales attributed to ads served on websites. And the reason we wrote the report is I don't think publishers have that feedback today. I think publishers have the ability to measure proxy metrics like viewability, but it's not clear at all to me that that's well correlated with actual business value created for marketers. Mm-hmm. And so I get the sense that a lot of publishers who are trying very hard to make the best ad products they can just don't have the data to do it. Mm-hmm. And so this report was sort of broad, and we don't need to talk about all of it. But one of the things that we took away from that report is, I think, a pretty simple and thoughtful way to measure ad load. If you measure ad load as the number of impressions served per user per minute, firstly, I think that way of measuring captures a lot of subtleties. It certainly would capture viewability. If you're refreshing ads when they're out of view, that would get captured. It was going to capture a lot of other things as well. High geometric density of the page, rapid refresh, things that are more subtle, like if you have a gallery and people are quickly ripping through pages in the gallery, and each page view results in a refreshed ad. While any individual screenshot of that ad experience might look perfectly reasonable, the actual lived visitor experience is pretty chaotic, and they're seeing an extremely fast pace of ads. And there's other nuance as well. My point is, I think impressions served per user per minute captures a bunch of nuance about what the actual consumer experience is, and critically is highly correlated with business outcomes. The average publisher on the web, as far as we can tell, delivers between 5 and 8 impressions per user per minute, which is a lot, but that's the norm. Publishers that are far below that significantly outperform on a marketer ROI basis. Mm-hmm. And publishers that are high above that significantly underperform on a marketer return on investment basis. And I just think there's a huge amount of tension in there for publishers. We're going to talk about parts of this. I don't want to get too far ahead in the conversation, but it's, again, a little bit of this like delicate balancing act, kind of a moving target. If you're a publisher who only serves one impression to a user every minute, you're probably creating fantastic business outcomes for marketers, and you're almost certainly leaving revenue on the table. And then if you're way on the other end of this thing, you're serving 25 impressions per user per minute, there's very likely a short-term revenue boost that business choice creates. But then there's some long-term risk that comes along with it because the inventory really just doesn't perform for marketers. And so probably the answer is to try to tune ad loads to be just sort of like in line with market norms. We're thinking a lot about how to identify supply that is heavy and light. But it's just another one of these places where I think running a web publishing business is this very delicate balancing act.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're talking about the balance of course, reaching your business outcomes, but also making sure you're reaching your audience and consumer in the right way and not just getting impressions based on business outcomes and how many you're reaching, but actually making sure you're creating a relationship with them based on your ad loads and impressions and different things like that. So that definitely makes a lot of sense from my point of view. And before we hop into the next topic, I did see a couple of questions in the chat. I know some of them do kind of touch on some of the things we talk about later, but I think they're great questions for what I've seen. First, from Gavin, is a certain DSP's campaign against resellers pointed question potentially misguided or short-sighted? Is there some value the buy side see in resellers and reselling?
Yeah. So, hey, Gavin. Look, I think here's my language. Tell me if you guys think this makes sense. There are end-to-end supply paths. The Trade Desk's open path, Amazon DSP accessing publisher inventory through APS, Yahoo Backstage. You can go down the list, and those are end-to-end paths because the company that processes the advertiser's campaign is integrated directly and issuing payment directly to publishers. That's one kind of a supply chain. Then there's supply chains that I call direct, which means the DSP pays an exchange who pays the publisher. And then there's auctions that I call them rebroadcasting. I think reselling is actually too broad of a term, but rebroadcasting, where you get these daisy chained exchanges. And so it's like a DSP pays one exchange, who pays another exchange, who then pays the publisher. That third category, I think, is extraordinarily wasteful. It's the thing that I referenced earlier being about a third of the bid stream. And I think demand's starting to dry up there and will eventually totally dry up there. But then among the first two, I just do not subscribe to the Trade Desk's messaging and market that you need to consider what I just call direct paths to be resold. I'm not sure quite how to litigate that or whether this is the right place to have that debate, but I just don't subscribe to that line of logic. I think there's a lot of merit to end-to-end paths. I think there's a lot of merit to direct exchange transactions. And my expectation is that those two transaction models are going to coexist for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, absolutely. And then one more question from Ellen. So question from a buyer trader perspective, should we just optimize SSPs first and then site list? Optimizing here means removing underperforming inventory based on our KPIs, ...
I think there's, we as an industry kind of missed the mark a little bit on some of the way that we think about supply path optimization. Building site lists makes a ton of sense. And I think it's really important, for what it's worth, for buyers to build inclusion lists of sites that they do want to buy, rather than attempting to continuously block sites they don't want to buy. We can talk more about that if that would be useful. I don't think it's super constructive to think about whether you should buy this site through one exchange versus another, because I think it kind of misses the much more important consideration. It is really common, not for every exchange, but for most of the majors, like run through your list, run through your mind the list of the first 5 exchanges you can think of. It is overwhelmingly the case that when a page view happens on a website, that exchange runs multiple auctions. It'll run an auction on behalf of the publisher through a pre-bid connection. It'll run an auction on behalf of the publisher through a TAM connection, maybe through a Google Open Bidding connection or some other wrapper. And it will also operate resold auctions on behalf of other intermediaries. And so when people say, is it better to buy CNN.com through Magnite or PubMatic? I just kind of think that's like totally the wrong question. It's buy CNN.com through auctions operated by Warner Brothers Discovery. That's the most important choice. And then very much a secondary choice is, should we use the WBD auction operated by PubMatic or the WBD auction operated by Magnite? That's still a relevant thing, but the much more important part is who's the seller. Is it Warner or is it a reseller?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for those great question, guys. Now we can move on to our very first topic. Our very first topic from the big news that happened in 2025 was the Google antitrust verdict, where the judge said that Google was a monopoly, and kind of the fallout afterward. And now we just kind of finished the process of the remedies trial that just wrapped up, I think, last week, 2 weeks ago, that actually one of our writers, James, got to sit through and write an article about. And a lot of people have been trying to deal with the fallout. A lot of people have been calling out Google for a long time. We've been hearing conversations about publishers trying to move away from dependency on GAM. What is Google's ads tech stack going to look like? How is that going to affect the rest of the ecosystem? So, Chris, from your perspective, how should publishers interpret the Google ad tech antitrust verdict in practical terms for their ad stack decisions over the next 12 to 24 months?
I don't know that I've got any. I don't think there's anything that publishers should probably be doing today. I think it's a waiting game.
Mm-hmm.
My guess, this is heavily borrowed from Ari Paparo. My guess is that we're not going to see any structural remedies. They'll all be behavioral remedies.
Mm-hmm.
But then the behavioral remedy that is obviously very needle moving for web publishers is a decoupling of Google Ads demand from Google Ad Manager, and specifically the possibility that Google builds a pre-bid adapter, or more generally, adapters for other sorts of mediation layers, whether it's pre-bid or something else. We don't know if that's going to happen, but if that happens, it's a huge unlock for publishers, and creates an enormous amount of flexibility for new vendors to enter the category or existing vendors to truly challenge Google Ad Manager and compete on the basis of product capabilities, not tying of demand. So I don't know. I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I think we may see at some point in 26 a lot more flexibility given to web publishers to explore publisher ad servers other than GAM without walking away from Google's revenue, Google's demand.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of publishers are already kind of exploring that. I know at Sell-Side Summit in Austin, we had a session with Politico, who were talking about some of the ways they're kind of moving away dependency from GAM and working with more ad servers. I mean, they were already working with different ad servers, but just kind of putting out like different feels about what other the ones are doing, and kind of some of the demand that they're kind of pulling from that, and it's working from them. So hopefully more publishers are kind of moving in that way, and not so into like, just because Google was who they were for so long doesn't mean that things have to stay the same way that they are. So that makes a lot of sense from my perspective. And let me see, before I make sure we have any more questions before we move on to our next topic, which is number 2, the debate on transaction IDs, which just kind of popped up randomly on one day after.
Yeah, this came out of nowhere, right?
No,
I did not see this storm brewing.
Yeah, and then how big it became, and then there became a conversation. Do publishers actually care about this? Is this just like what people are just kind of talking about? Is this just the new ad tech thing to talk about now for these days? And after pre-bid kind of changed their policy on how trans IDs are kind of pushed through the supply path bid stream, and then especially after the Trade Desk released open path and kind of reinstated what pre-bid was doing before. So as we kind of look towards that, from Jounce's vantage point, what are the real economic stakes of the transaction ID debate for publishers versus the more theoretical or privacy arguments that get all the airtime?
Well, I do think that those privacy arguments are pretty theoretical, which is not to say they're wrong, but I have yet to hear a very concrete articulation of what the privacy concerns are. I do think there's clarity or specificity, I guess, on like some of the other puts and takes for whether to implement transaction IDs or not. And to be clear, I'm talking about like real implementation of transaction IDs, like an ID that is common across all supply chains for each available impression. Here's my basic thinking on it. From the publisher's perspective, I think if I were a publisher, I would very much be concerned that DSPs are going to use a transaction ID to deduplicate the bid stream, which of course they are going to do. That was probably use case number 1. And that creates winners and losers. You know what I mean? Like as a publisher, if you are creating more request duplication than the average, well, deduplication is scary. If you're creating less duplication than average, then deduplication is fantastic. You're not getting your fair share of spend today. And a deduplicated bid stream will result in more spend going to you. And so I just think that's sort of like a zero sum game. It's very important. It's not zero sum for each individual publisher. It's a huge strategic consideration for publishers. But it would be a leveling of the market so that the publishers that have excess duplication don't take excess market share. I think it'd be great for the market, but I understand that that's a trade-off for each individual publisher. I think the other component here, which I wish the industry would talk more about, is transaction IDs are an extraordinarily effective tool in fighting fraud and in fighting hidden fees. You now have a common key between every link in the chain. Billing reconciliation becomes much easier. But even more important than that, it becomes trivially easy for a buyer, like an agency on one end and a publisher far at the other end of the supply chain, to just make sure that the inventory the buyer bought was authentic. There remains spoofed inventory in the bid stream that is just not real. This is less of a problem in the web than in connected TV, but even in the web, spoofing remains an issue. Ads.txt is a good but not perfect solution. A transaction ID is a perfect solution. The buyer can compare its list of purchased impressions against the publisher's logs of what it actually sold. And I just wish the industry spent a little more time thinking about those fraud fighting benefits and fee identification benefits of a transaction ID.
Yeah, absolutely. One more question from Gavin before I hop into my next one, touching on a point that you just brought up. Are there alternative ways for the buy side to deduplicate, I think, the bid stream, or de-dilute the bid stream?
I mean, yes, but it's real hard, like real hard. And essentially what you have to do on the buy side of the market as a DSP is create a synthetic transaction ID for each inbound request. You hash together a bunch of values in the request, the timestamp, the user ID, the page URL, a couple other things. And you'd say, like, it appears to me that I received 13 concurrent requests for this one available impression. The reason that's hard is you have to log the whole bid stream to do it. And almost no one logs the whole bid stream. Most DSPs log a sample of the bid stream. And so it becomes really quite difficult to sort of comprehensively dedupe the bid stream today. A transaction ID would make that much easier.
Yes, absolutely. And where do you land on who should quote unquote own or control TID policy? Is it the browser OS, intermediaries like SSPs, publishers themselves? And what are the risks for publishers if they stay passive on this?
I mean, I think it has to be a publisher decision.
Mm-hmm.
And publishers, look, I don't think I appreciate that this is a complicated choice, but I also think, like, for publishers, I'm not sure there's much of like a philosophical debate here. It's like, does populating transaction IDs result in making more money? If yes, do it. If not, don't. Publishers can A/B test their way into this thing. And I think every publisher is well within its rights to make a decision about whether to implement or not.
Yeah. I mean, I think you bring up a good point. If it makes you money, it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. And especially as publishers think about the way that they're using transaction IDs. I kind of brought up a little bit before how pre-bid kind of changed, how they were using transaction IDs and how the trade desk with OpenPass kind of reinstated what they were doing. As publishers kind of think about that and weigh those options, like using pre-bids model, open ads, or hybrid, what are the key trade-offs in transparency, leverage, and long-term interoperability? And like, how should publishers be thinking about the ways that they use that in that way?
Well, I think it's part of, we will definitely talk about the specific question you asked. I just think it's part of a broader theme of, the leverage that the buy side of the market has over the sell side. Google, Amazon, and the trade desk control more than half of spend. It's probably like 60% of all spend. So they have a ton of leverage. They can really vote with their algorithms. Essentially, the buyers control the money, but only indirectly. The bidding algorithms really control where the money goes. And so those companies have just a lot of leverage, obviously, over publishers.
Mm-hmm.
On the transaction ID thing, my best guess of how this evolves is that publishers that make the bet that they would benefit from the existence of a transaction ID will implement. the big DSPs will preference participation in those auctions. And over time, it becomes logistically just not possible for a publisher to not implement transaction IDs because there's a financial reward for implementing or a financial penalty for not. And so you wind up having buyer behavior pull every publisher into adopting transaction IDs. That's my best guess of how this thing goes. And for what it's worth, I think that'd be good for the market, but that's sort of like not the way you'd want to get to a healthy place. You know, you don't want one or two powerful companies to sort of force this. You want it to sort of happen because of the market votes. I'm not sure that's how this is going to go. Similarly, my guess is that we do see broad adoption of open ads, Trade Desk's wrapper service over the coming months or year. It's not clear to me that publishers are going to implement open ads because they think it's a better product or because they're sort of philosophically aligned with some of the auditability that the Trade Desk has implemented, all of which I think is fantastic. And I do think it's a great product. But I think publishers are going to implement because it's a way to get an outsized share of Trade Desk spend. And then again, you have this, it's the same process, right? The publishers that adopt open ads first take an outsized share of Trade Desk demand, very understandably, very rationally. It's the connection point that the Trade Desk trusts the most, and so they'll spend the most there. Publishers that don't adopt will see disproportionately small share of Trade Desk demand, and logically over time then wind up adopting. And so I think that's for transaction IDs, for open ads, basically for anything else that the big buy-side platforms want, this will be sort of like the sequence of operations, and they can build very broad adoption of whatever sell-side tools they want.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know when open ads was announced and the whole TID debate was happening, I kind of wrote an article talking to some publishers about kind of what they were doing. So maybe a next update article will be just to kind of follow up with some publishers to kind of see how they're using open ads, how they're kind of thinking about TID within that platform now, and what kind of other ways they're using ad service. So that could definitely be. So if any publishers in the audience, just, to kind of work for some articles, have any ideas about that, how they're thinking about that, just hit me up. And that could definitely be something that we look forward to and something we can kind of bring to our audience as we go.
Andrew, if we can just stick on that for one more minute. I think what I just said is sort of easy to say right now, or at least easy for me to say right now, because I actually think that a lot of these, the two things we just discussed, open ads and transaction ID, I think both of those are good in concept and good in practice, and adoption would be good for the industry. And so like it's kind of easy to just say like it's going to happen and here's why, and that would be good for the industry. I just think we should all have our antenna up for like, well, what would happen if we actually thought some of these initiatives were bad for the market, and like how would we as an industry manage the tension, whether it's coming from Google or the Trade Desk or Amazon or someone else? How would we manage the tension of a powerful buy-side company trying to drive adoption of a solution that the industry doesn't like? I'm guessing some people on this webinar don't like some of the initiatives from the Trade Desk. I do. So it's easy for me to be like, oh, I'm on board. Like, how do you deal with this? Or when Google rolled out unified pricing rules in whatever year that was, publishers didn't like it, but they had to take it. And it's just not obvious to me that we have a structural protection against similar things continuing to happen. I don't see any in front of us right now, but I also worry a little bit that we don't have the structural balance of force in place that's needed.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point. I think that's something we did bring up in the article. I think there is some kind of skepticism about some of the Trade Desk tactics, especially in relation to what things are happening with Google. I think there is some kind of PTSD going on with the way Google has run things and the way that, the Trade Desk, but, some publishers believe that. There's publishers who have been outspoken that they say that the comparison isn't fair. The Trade Desk themselves kind of said in the article that the comparison isn't fair. But I think that definitely is a very good point to kind of bring up, because there is kind of that tension between, there's just one big DSP that's kind of pushing people to adopt this thing, is it good or bad? Only testing and time will tell. So that definitely is a good point to bring up for sure. Just looking in the comments to see if there's any more questions about TIDs before we move on to our next topic, which I don't see any. And our next topic is everyone's favorite shiny new toy, everyone's favorite new thing to talk about, AI. And so AI, specifically for publishers, has been one a big way that has been stealing publishers' traffic. Just think AI overview, which is pulling people from kind of clicking on publisher sites. There's, talk about AI platforms kind of stealing content for publishers and not really paying them well. There's talks about how publishers can kind of implement AI within their own companies and within their own stack to see kind of how they're doing it. And so from your perspective, Chris, how is AI changing the ways the audiences find and consume publisher content? And what are you seeing in the data around AI answers, displacing search-driven traffic and hurting RPMs and different things like that? Just what are your kind of thoughts around this? How can publishers kind of navigate
Well, I think that the maybe somewhat unique perspective that I can bring relates to something we're working on right now. Every January, we publish our January report every year is an analysis of the largest sources of premium supply. We call these companies bellwethers. And the basic idea is make a stack rank list of the biggest publishers ranked by DSP spend across web, mobile app, and connected TV inventory. Remove from that list any publisher that we don't think meets some baseline quality standards, and then select the 100 biggest that are left. And we do this every year, and it sort of highlights that the market's actually pretty concentrated, that the top 100 publishers capture 70 to 75% of spend. And we track these companies really closely over the course of the year. Anyway, we're in the process of making that bellwether list for 2026. And in the mobile app category and in the CTV category, it's like basically the same list as 2025. On the web, it's a very different list. And it becomes very clear which publishers have really taken a traffic hit due to, I guess, AI overviews specifically, but maybe just sort of consumer attention shifting to AI services. What has not taken a hit is games. And there are publishers that we'll likely include in our 2026 bellwether list that were just simply too small last year in the gaming category. I'm not sure they've even grown. I think they might have just been flat, but flat's the new up. And so many of their peers have seen 20, 30, sometimes 50% traffic declines due to Google search. But if you host a game, that doesn't get replaced by AI. And so I think that's just like a fact, I guess, that it's a notable shift. But I think that probably has a big effect on sort of what successful web publishers need to look like over time. That you can't just be producing content that can be scooped up and synthesized for a user. You need to be creating experiences that cannot be synthesized for a user.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on to your point about flat being the new up, I remember I can't remember what publisher it was at Southside Summit Austin, and they like made the announcement, we're flat, and like the room bursted out.
Yeah.
This really speaks to like the state that publishers are in right now. So
we shouldn't laugh about that. That's
that's
the reality.
I know, but it really just speaks to the state that publishers in. And I think you bring a good point where publishers need to focus on experiences as far as instead of just like regenerated content. And I remember, hopefully I say this right, but I remember at a previous one as well, Steph Laser kind of did a talk about, thinking of publishers as like a product or as like a ecosystem instead of, just as this like website or publication that people come to, kind of thinking about different ways that publishers can kind of maneuver, because there's just so many different things that people are kind of, dealing with as publishers, even outside of AI, that are kind of hurting their traffic and pulling people to their audiences as well. So, yeah. As Lynn said, flat is the new up. That is a bar, but is it a good one? LOL. Absolutely. And on to our final topic for the LinkedIn Live. Something that we did kind of touch on a little bit based on Gavin's question is the SSP Reseller Debate. And, some people who we might have mentioned before has said that they relabeled SSPs as resellers. So Chris, I just kind of wanted to hear your perspective on that, and where do you kind of see SSPs and resellers fitting in, and where are they adding value for publishers?
If it's okay, let me react to just something slightly different that you just said and that was in the chat before. I feel like there's this thing where like people don't want to say the trade desk when they talk about this, and like it sort of suggests like some fear of like punitive action or something. And like, I totally disagree with this labeling of SSPs as resellers. And also I don't run a media business, so maybe I don't have to sort of like deal, but I do run a research business, and like, I've never sensed anything like that from the trade desk. I think they're like generally pretty open to just sort of having people like me or you or others sort of say like, hey, we disagree with this. We think this is a misstep. And I mean, I do disagree with this.
I mean,
But I think it's just interesting that like the industry seems to like, so there's a DSP that, and it's like, no, it's the trade desk. They did a thing and we disagree with it. And like, we can say that, and they're not going to like come like, you know, drop the hammer on someone's business. You know, I do think true reselling, these long supply chains, a DSP pays an exchange, pays another exchange, who pays the publisher. I do understand that that creates incremental revenue for publishers. I do not think that creates value for buyers. And I think buyers are going to vote over time with their budgets, and demand's going to dry up in those supply chains. I think the SSPs that are highly dependent on demand from other SSPs rather than from DSPs are looking at a pretty existential risk over the next few years. Many of them will evolve. They're already starting to do that, but that kind of reselling should go away, and I think it's going to go away. Magnite running an auction on behalf of Warner Brothers Discovery and sending a bid request to DV360 is not reselling, in my opinion. Those are structurally not that different from end-to-end paths. There's a sell-side piece of technology that's running an auction. There's a buy-side of technology that's calculating a bid. There's reasonable fees along the chain. I just don't see. I don't see the structural problem. I think there's some structural advantages to that kind of a supply chain. What I guess I would say is it's kind of hard to think that over the long run, the RTB category has publishers working with 26 SSPs, maybe 3, maybe 5, maybe 10, but not 26. And so my hope is that, you know, the winning the serious broadly deployed SSPs consolidate market share, and then they need to kind of go to bat to make the pitch to buyers about why an RTB transaction is every bit as good as an end-to-end transaction, open path, backstage, and so on. That's a debate that we should have. Or is one better than the other? But to just like categorically exclude one as reselling, I don't think that's a fair read of the value those companies create.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just have to call out Gavin's comment, which is the DSP who cannot be named in all caps. And
that was in the back of my mind. That was in my mind. You know, it feels like that, right? You could say it's Voldemort. You could say it's okay.
Yes,
you know?
And I just to clarify, I was not trying to say that the trade desk is ad-tax Voldemort at all. I just like to be dramatic as I ask my questions. But
no, I think it's like a whole thing around the industry. Like even private conversations, people will sort of like hint at this DSP that isn't. It's like I think we can talk about it. And I think, you know, to give the trade desk credit where I really think they deserve it, they've I think pretty consistently been willing to show up at your events, take one-on-one meet. Like I think they engage in this conversation.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And even with articles that I've written this year, the trade desk has definitely been open to come to conversation, talk about the criticisms that they're hearing, say why they disagree. So I 10,000% agree with you on that. And kind of next question based on some of the things we talked about already. At the beginning, you talked about you see publishers working with 26 SSPs, and your answers now, you kind of see that kind of cutting down, and that kind of makes sense with stuff I'm hearing from publishers who have been saying for years they think there's too many intermediaries in the supply chain. And so as publishers kind of rationalize, you know, what SSPs to work with in the future, what data-driven tests would you recommend to decide, you know, which SSPs to keep, consolidate, cut entirely?
So I said something before, which I think was right. And it's a little different in this case. I said something about transaction IDs that like you A/B test it. If it makes you more money, do it. If it doesn't, don't. I don't think it's quite like that with SSPs. Or at least I think you'd run the risk of making the right short-term decision and the wrong long-term decision. There's a whole bunch of bad incentives for SSPs to do things that are really damaging to the market in order to increase the yield of any individual publisher. You can duplicate requests. You can tamper with signals in those bid requests. You can move around your take rate from one impression to the next. And so if publishers are starting to think about thinning out their ad tech stack, which again, I'm not sure is a move that makes sense today, but is probably a move that makes sense over the next several months or years. I think it's I think the decision has to be more than an A/B test of which exchange generates the most incremental revenue, or that publisher will be left with exchanges that are the most loose, with sort of walking the line of potential misrepresentation of inventory and violating industry norms.
Yeah, absolutely. Just checking the comments to see if we're anything before I go to my final question. Someone in the comments says going to be interesting with the direction they go without Judd. Absolutely. And this is kind of me spitballing a question. We talked about a lot of different topics throughout this conversation: the Google Antitrust trial, AI, the TID debate, and then just now SSPs and resellers. And recapping 2025 and looking forward to 2026, what kind of just final words of advice would you have to publishers to kind of, survive as the next year comes around?
I mean, I think it's across multiple dimensions. This is specifically for the web. I think across multiple dimensions, it is finding sort of this like conceptual sweet spot between the thing that maximizes today's revenue and the thing that maximizes long-term revenue. I'll give you an anecdote that might help. I had a call earlier this week with a local news publisher that our internal models indicate has a very high ad load, serving a very high rate of impressions per minute, like 20 to 25 impressions per minute, which is way outside of industry norms. I took a minute to manually review their highest volume URLs, look at it on desktop, look at it on a mobile app, just to feel confident, like, I think our models are right. I should go talk to this publisher, and I should, first of all, make sure our numbers are right. Try to offer some guidance on sort of why we think high ad load is, really bad for marketers, and try to approach it in a collaborative way rather than just like slap some negative logo on their supply. And to their credit, they were just sort of like very direct and gave me a window into how they think about these things. And it really came down to, as their traffic declines and they've got a revenue number to hit, the lever that remains is just continuing to crank up the ad load, which does work in the short term. But then what they were asking me is like, listen, if you put a negative label on our inventory, how many buyers are going to stop buying? Because if that answer is small, we have to continue to operate at this high ad load. And if that number is big, well, then we need to reconsider our current strategy. And I appreciated the honesty, and I think that helped me get a window into sort of what the publishing business is like. And I think if you're a publisher, whether we're talking about ad load or reselling or a variety of other operational choices, if you live very far on the aggressive end of the spectrum, I think it's playing with fire. And I think there's a real possibility that our data from DeepSea, data from Open Sincera, data from others will guide buyers to block that supply, which is obviously a real risk. And then similarly, if you're on the other end of the spectrum and you operate as a Boy Scout, you're almost certainly leaving revenue on the table. If you serve one impression per user session, if you only work with 2 SSPs, that's naive. And so it's like, all right, well, now what's this range in the middle? And that range is constantly moving. So I think that just is the reality for web publishers. And I think probably the best thing to monitor is like, just what are current market norms? What are the 26 SSPs? Like, that's a high ceiling, that's what's normal. 5 to 8 impressions per minute, that's what's normal. And I think publishers on the web should be thinking about like, how do we stay within industry norms so that you're not leaving money on the table today, but you're also not running the risk of sort of having buyers block your supply.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be a great place to end it. But before I do, I did see one more great question from Brendan Norman in the comments before we end things off. How do you see new protocols like AdCP influencing these predictions?
I mean, I think AdCP has a bunch of promise, but I think it's just promise at this point. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure anybody's baking AdCP into their 2026 revenue forecast. And I guess that also sort of means in some sense, it's almost like a luxury good. You know what I mean? Like, if it's all hands on deck to maintain traffic and maintain RPM in 2026, then AdCP, it's gonna be hard to dedicate resources to something experimental. And the companies that, to say that differently, then the companies that are experimenting with AdCP either are sort of working off venture capital or are businesses that have excess profits that they can use to invest in the next thing. And so, we should all watch that evolution. It's amazing. I mean, it's really exciting what those working groups are starting to put together. But I think we're still quite a ways away from that being material revenue for anybody in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you, Chris, for participating in this conversation. Always a pleasure, as always dropping nuggets of knowledge for our audience. And I know I saw a comment earlier that I wanted to address. Ellen, you were saying you're saying so much at a time. I want to take some more notes. And just to say that there will be a post LinkedIn Live article that will be going up onto the site where the video will be displayed, and we'll like kind of mull through some of the topics that we discussed on the LinkedIn Live. So Ellen, or anyone who's kind of looking for that stuff, look out for that as well. And before I let you go, we do have some announcements to for you guys. One, we have an event coming up and an award show, the Convergent TV event and the Convergent TV Awards, where we are honoring people across the entire screen ecosystem. That includes television, streaming, gaming, digital out of home, retail media, and emerging platforms. The event will be from December 5th to 6th, and the award show will be on the night of December 5th. And the deadline for those awards, I believe, are this Friday. So please, if you yourself or anyone you can nominate, please do that. And we also have an upcoming webinar with the Weather Company on Tuesday, December 16th at 11 a.m. with Ad Exchangers. So if you're looking for some new insights in that way, please join that as well. And then finally, we have some AdMonsters events coming up in 2026. As I mentioned, Convergent TV World in New York, March 5th through 6th. We have Programmatic IO in New York and Las Vegas. The New York one is September 28th to 29th in New York, and the Programmatic AI, sorry about that, in Las Vegas will be May 18th to the 20th. And we also will be co-locating AdMonsters sell-side summits at these events as well in New York and Las Vegas. There will be some co-location, but for publishers who are worried, at sell-side summits, it will still be its own thing with publisher-focused content. We're just kind of co-locating them in one event. And then finally, we have our Top Women Week in New York in November 9th through 13th with different Top Women award shows across our Chief Marketer network and brands. So again, thank you guys so much for joining us for this LinkedIn Live. And thank you again, Chris, for joining us. Hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Okay.